There we go. For the next 10 minutes, I'm going to take you to the other side of the world, over to here. I'm going to talk a little bit about Stonehenge. It's quite an old monument and starts about 3000 BC, and it has a continuous usage through to at least 1500 BC, and of course some sporadic usage after that as well. Now I've got quite a few slides, so I'm going to move fairly quickly through some of the things, but I hope much of what I'm going to say will resonate with things that we've already heard from other parts of the world, because what's going on here in prehistory is very similar to what's been going on over in the areas we've been hearing about. Let me just quickly remind you, in case you're not quite sure where we are. Stonehenge is down at the bottom here, and we're also going to be talking about this area over here in West Wales, which is known as the Preseli Hills, and those are rather important in understanding Stonehenge. Well, there's a lot to say about Stonehenge, and I'm going to skip all of it to say simply that there's two main kinds of stones here. These big ones at the back here, which are very local to Stonehenge, and I'm not going to say any more about that at all, but the ones I'm interested in are these much smaller ones, which are known as bluestones, and they are built inside this larger structure. So that if we look at a reconstruction view, we have the big stones around here, but it's these little ones inside that I'm interested in, which are, as I say, known as bluestones. There's a circle here, and there's another circle inside there as well. So there's two circles in this particular form. Now, when we look at these stones, you can see again their scale. We've got a meter scale here. They're generally speaking between 1 meter and 2 meters high. Some of them in the center are quite well formed. The ones around the outside are a little bit less well formed, and we'll see why that might have some relevance in just a moment. They've been studied for quite a long time, and we know that there's a lot of different geologies involved here. Spotted dolerites, rhyolites, blue rhyolite, grey rhyolites, various tuffs, number of different kinds of sandstone. They're not all the same lithologies at all, but we do know since the 1920s that the source of almost all of these stones is in the far west, in this area, which I showed you on the map just now, which is known as the Preseli Hills. And this geologist, Herbert Thomas, was the first person to really recognize that and properly document it back in the 1920s. Well, here's a map just confirming that detail, as it were. The Preseli Hills are over here in West Wales. Stonehenge is down here, and there are various optional routes that we could use to get the stones from over here down to here, including, which is not shown on this map, of course, an overland route, which might work as well. The sea and the stones might come together, and we've just talked about that a little bit. There may be some relevance in what's going on there. Let's just go across to the Preseli Hills, though, and this is what we see when we get there. It's a rugged place. There's a lot of different outcrops, and the important point is that many of those different kinds of rock at Stonehenge come from different outcrops in the area of the Preselis. Some of them on the top of the hills, such as we see here, but some of them off this photograph from areas around about. And we know of probably about 12 or 15 maybe different source areas now. So they don't all come from one outcrop. These stones, and there's about 80 of them at Stonehenge, come from a range of outcrops, of which some seem to contribute quite a lot, and some contribute very few, just a few stones. Now, there is a relationship with sacred geography and a kind of a mnemonic between the real landscape and the monumentalized landscape. Here we see a geological map of the Preseli Hills, and some of the outcrops which have been exploited are marked here. In the center, we have a series of outcrops which yield essentially dolerites, and around the outside, we have a series of outcrops which yield the rhyolites and the tuffs and the slates and so on. Now, that sort of concentric pattern that you see here is in fact represented at Stonehenge as well. If we just go back there for a moment, we have the outer ring, which is mostly these rhyolites and tuffs, and then we have the inner setting, which is exclusively the dolerites from the center of the landscape. So we have this interesting relationship, if you like, a miniature landscape at Stonehenge of a real landscape, which is best part of 200 kilometers away to the west. When we go back to Preseli, we also begin to recognize something that's been mentioned by other speakers, that in fact the like the relationship between construction and natural, if such a division is relevant, is very, very blurred. Here we've got some natural outcrops which do look, in a sense, very structured. And these two things go together, I think, in the way that bits of the landscape have been appropriated and taken across the Stonehenge. Those dolerites that I mentioned are, in a sense, very attractive. They have a bluey green core with these white spots in them, and it's referred to as a spotted dolerite. And they are very distinctive, but they only occur in particular outcrops across the Preselis. We know of quite a few of these archaeologically. Mike Parker Pearson's done some excavations, and we've done some excavations there as well. And we have the quarry sites. Here's one of them being examined, for example, and here you see some fire setting against some of the stones. And when we look at the dates we have from them, the important point to recognize is that these go back way beyond Stonehenge. We're talking about dates going back into the 6th and 7th millennium BC here, with quarrying appropriate to Stonehenge here in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. So we've got plenty of things going on up there. Well, this is, in a sense, the archaeological background. How do we interpret some of this stuff? How do we put it all together? And we have to ask ourselves the question of why the Preseli Hills are so important in what's going on over in Wiltshire. Well, this cartoon, in a sense, sums up the problem, but it's an archaeological problem as well. Lots of suggestions have been made. We could think of these outcrops, these mountains, simply as sacred places, if you like, the kind of Mount Olympus of the Neolithic world in Northwest Europe, the place where the gods lived, and that's certainly possible. We can think about all sorts of ideas about acoustic responses, which are certainly relevant to the Preseli Hills and indeed the Stonehenge as well. And the stones do make particular sounds, and that's something which can be thought about too. Some people have suggested that there may be a kind of a simulacra relationship between outcrops on the Preselis. You see here somebody sitting down maybe, and maybe somebody sitting in their bath over here. That the outcrops themselves can be recognized in this sort of way. And then the stone itself has obviously some potential for interpretation as well. This spotted effect is quite distinctive, and one wonders, for example, of whether this is the night sky simply reflected in the earth. And we've got a kind of a convergence of cosmologies between what we see in the skyscape and what we feel and see on the landscape, and bringing those two together could be quite important as well. And you can make up all sorts of other stories as well. You know, these could be the raindrops of the first storm on Earth. These could be the tears of the great gods shed onto the landscape and so on. It's almost endless possibilities. They're all possible, but how do we tie some of these things down to a more archaeological explanation? Perhaps something grounded in the material that we've got. Well, all sorts of lines of inquiry help us on this, but they all focus on the idea of the power of stone, which is, of course, a theme that's run through almost all of our presentations today. The power of stone as being something incredibly important. You see somebody in the bottom of this picture carrying a massive great block of it. It's lapis lazuli, in fact, but carrying a massive great block out of a quarry. Well, these sorts of thoughts and these sorts of powers actually go back into quite an ancient literature. And I just mentioned this one. A classical source, Pliny the Elder, wrote a natural history in 37 books, of which 36 and 37 deal with the question of stone and mineralogy, not from a Western scientific kind of point of view, but he discusses the alleged magic powers of stone, the gender links of stone, the supposed healing properties of different kinds of stone, and the notions of good health and healing that worked in the ancient world in relation to stone. And this seems to be quite a theme. And it relates especially to Stonehenge, because the first time that we hear about Stonehenge in the literature is through the words of a 12th century monk, whose name is Geoffrey of Monmouth, who's writing about the site and writing about its sources. And he says, in discussing the site here, "Try not to laugh in such a foolish way, Your Majesty," answered Merlin. Merlin was a wizard, of course. "What I'm suggesting is nothing ludicrous about it. These stones are connected with certain secret religious rites, and they have various properties which are medicinally important." And this is the backbone of a set of arguments that we've used to think about Stonehenge, and particularly these bluestones, over the last few years and through our researches and investigations. Now, luckily, Geoffrey of Monmouth goes on to describe how it all works, and what you have to do is to make a bath, a water bath, and put the stones in and take the stones out, and people get in and people get out and so on. And this is what happens. Now, up in the Preseli Mountains, what we find is exactly what we might expect from this sort of line of thinking. There are pools created, natural pools created around spring heads, which seem to be the places where these, or near to the places where these stones have been exploited. So here's one, for example. You can see the ranging rods in one of these little pools. There's a spring you can see from the vegetation coming out, and the stream runs down here in the foreground. And around these places, we very often find burial cairns. Here's that spring we were just looking at, for example. Here we've got burial cairns, prehistoric cairns above. And we also find little bits of rock art here occasionally. Here's one, for example, just above that spring. And here's another one. This is just below Carn, Menyn, where many of these outcrops of stone were taken. Here's a pool. Here's where the spring runs down. And here on this stone over here, again, we've got rock art in the form of these cut marks on the rock. So there's lots of nice connections there. Moreover, in more recent times, if we look at the, if you like, the Bluestone Trail between the Preseli Mountains here and across into southern Britain, there's a number of places along this line where we seem to find the same traditions represented. I'll just very quickly mention three of them. This is in the far west, Ilo's Well, which is a saint's well where you took his cranium and took water from the well. It's completely surrounded by stones of exactly this kind of spotted dolerite, and you use the water for healing purposes. Here's the traditional view of a person doing exactly that. This is another one, the Salas Church in Llangan West. Here we see the church, lovely enclosure showing us a crop mark around it. And in that churchyard is a stone that you see here. It's a piece of spotted dolerite. And the legend is that if you sit on this stone, and it's got a nice little hollow for you to sit in, and drink the water from the adjacent well, you will be healed of your ailments. What they are is a matter of debate, I think. And here's a third one, which just takes us forward a little bit more. This is the so-called Colmer stone, which in the church in Newport, you lie on this stone. Here it is, it's still there. This is a picture from 1770, and the stone cures your ailments. And at Stonehenge itself, we have people stealing bits of stone going back into medieval and post-medieval times for exactly the same reason. You could hire a hammer in the local village and knock off a bit of stone in this sort of way. So we've got some nice tradition, nice folklore from medieval period onwards, and plenty of evidence of this. What about Stonehenge itself? Well, here we've got a map of the Stonehenge landscape. Stonehenge is here. We've got an avenue which leads down, where I'm pointing with the cursor, down to the River Avon. So we've got a nice connection with water going on there. But perhaps more importantly, what we find is that lots of bits of bluestone from Stonehenge turn up in burials around about, in the landscape around about. Now, not all of the burial mounds have been investigated, of course, but some of those which have yield this kind of evidence. And when we look at the burials associated with this, we find that many of them are in a state of fairly high trauma. So here's one, for example, it's a beaker burial, contemporary with Stonehenge. It had a trephination of the skull, and we have the bit here, and in the grave was a piece of rhyolite from Stonehenge in that same deposit. In the Stonehenge ditch, there is a burial. It was a person who was shot by 3 arrows, and they were the cause of death. See the dates there. And in the grave with this person was 3 pieces of bluestone deposited with the burial. And third one, just to emphasize the point, here's another burial mound. It's a round barrow. Adult male had a very severe trauma, not a trephination, it's a trauma where somebody's beaten this guy over the head with a club. The bone's been picked out, it started to heal again, and yet again in there we've got bluestone with the burial in the site. So this connection between the bluestones from Wales and the Stonehenge deposits and burials in the area round about really leads us to think that what we're talking about here is Stonehenge as a place that was used essentially as a large healing centre. It probably wasn't the only use of it, But the stone at Stonehenge and the power of that stone, and particularly the power of the bluestone, is all about its relationship with healing and its source in a set of mountains way over to the west, where that same tradition is being upheld. I hope that touches on a number of themes that we've picked on already.